Welcome to the Mid-Atlantic Association of Museums virtual program, Redefining Narrative, a series of conversations with scholars and leaders in the cultural sector. I'm Deborah Schwartz, and I serve on the Mid-Atlantic Association of Museums Board of Directors, and I am delighted to be your host. Redefining Narrative invites viewers to explore new approaches to working within the cultural sector, presenting fresh ideas about the pressing issues of our time, and in many cases, disrupting age-old formulas for what we expect to find within the confines of museums. Each episode is approximately 30 to 40 minutes, and we hope each of our 5-part series will encourage conversation and debate for people working in museums, as well as students and the general public who are curious about why and how museums make choices about their exhibitions and programs. On behalf of the staff and board of the Mid-Atlantic Association, I want to acknowledge that this program was funded in part by Humanities New York with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. In today's episode of Redefining Narrative, we'll look at the topic of environmental justice from the perspective that is too often ignored. Too often, we talk about natural resource conservation in a silo, separating the discussion from the social constructs and systemic racism that are actually at the core of the environmental crisis that has reached new heights in the United States and across the globe. Our guests today have been quick to recognize that disconnect and have created an ambitious initiative that locate issues of racism, identity, and environmental justice in the center of a part of American history that is often romanticized and inaccurately described. Their work has the potential to help us move into the future with course corrections in creating a socially equitable world and in our ability to deal with the mounting environmental crises we so urgently need to address. It is my privilege to introduce our guests who will speak for about 25 minutes, and then we will follow with a very brief question and answer session. David Kahn is Executive Director of the Adirondack Experience in Blue Mountain Lake, New York. Prior to joining the organization, he led the Brooklyn Historical Society, the Connecticut Historical Society, the Louisiana State Museum, and the San Diego History Center. He received both his BA and MA degrees in art history from Columbia University. And if I may, on a personal note, say that it was my privilege to follow David as president of the Brooklyn Historical Society. There were a few people in between us, but I just want to say that it was his very forward-thinking work in the area of oral history and his investigations into communities of color in Brooklyn that were truly inspiring and brilliant and helped me to do my work. Erik Reardon is an environmental historian specializing in Indigenous and Euro-American relationships with rivers and the historic dimensions of fisheries conservation and dam removal. He received his PhD from the University of Maine and has taught as a visiting assistant professor at Colby College and Bates College. This past July, his book, Managing the River Commons, Fishing and New England's Rural Economy, was published by the University of Massachusetts Press. He is project director for the Adirondack Experience's Adirondacks for All, Identity and Environmental Justice in the North Country. So let me start by welcoming David. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Deborah, and thank you for those very kind words. Well, what I'm going to do is introduce my institution and tell a rather circuitous story about how we ended up presenting a series online of programs that relate to the subject of environmental justice. A little bit about the museum. We were founded in 1957, and we are right in the middle of the Adirondack Park. And the park is a 6 million acre construct, really. We call it a park, but half the land is privately owned and the other half belongs to the state of New York. The place is the size of the state of Vermont, but it is very sparsely populated. There are about 130,000 people who live here. In the tiny hamlet of Blue Mountain Lake, where the museum is located, there are only 200 year-round residents. In the summer, the population swells. There are literally millions of visitors that come to the Adirondacks. We're only open as a museum during the season, which goes from Memorial Day through Labor Day. And given the dynamics of the small local population versus the number of visitors and tourists, about 80% of our visitors are actually from someplace else. So the museum has over 20 buildings. We're on over 120 acres. We have over 60,000 square feet of exhibits. So it's quite a large place. Now it's interesting in this period of time we all live when diversity and equity are huge issues. This is a place that is anything but diverse. And what I'm showing you here is a map of New York State, which was put together by Cornell's College of Human Ecology. And right at the center there, you see kind of a beige, orangey, yellowy kind of area circled by a blue line. That is the Adirondack Park. And each of these little dots that you see here represents 100 people, BIPOC people. So you can see that the year-round, the permanent population is not diverse at all. In fact, about more than 95% of the resident population is white. And that's also true of the millions of visitors who come and visit the Adirondacks each year as well. And you'll note the footnote there on the map. It indicates that it excludes institutional group quarters, which I guess is some sort of euphemism for prisons, and that there are lots and lots of prisons in the Adirondacks, and the population of the prisons is overwhelmingly Black and brown people. And Erik will be talking a little bit about that in a little while. Well, for most of our history, the exhibits at the Adirondack Experience have focused on traditional stories of logging, of mining, outdoor recreation, boating. These are all subjects that were of great interest to our founder. We were established by one millionaire who created the museum and actually ran it on a day-to-day basis until he died in 1981. So around when I got here, 2011, 2012, we started to work on a new exhibit master plan for the institution. It was intended to sort of flesh out the stories that we tell and bring the exhibits and the overall experience into the 21st century. So in 2017, we opened a new core 19,000 square foot exhibit called Life in the Adirondacks. And in that exhibit, we included this section that's devoted to the story of the Mohawk and Abenaki communities. Now, we had never told that story before. And again, the institution reflected the interests of its founder. And I guess he just wasn't interested in Native American history. But our visitor studies, if you look back over decades, and whenever the museum would ask people, is there anything that you didn't learn about today and you'd be interested in learning about, it was always Native Americans. So finally, in 2017, we opened this exhibit, and we did so after working for several years with members of the Mohawk and Abenaki community, both scholars and regular everyday people. And much of the material that's in the exhibit was specifically collected for it because we didn't really have much that depicted Native American history. Now, one of the interesting things about all of this is that our founder wasn't alone in not being particularly interested in Native American history, and that from the moment I arrived at the Adirondack Experience in the Adirondacks, I heard from people that, well, Native Americans didn't really live here. They sort of lived at the edges because, it's cold here, and they couldn't have lived here year round. And what's more, the soil is very rocky, so there was, they couldn't farm here. So it wasn't really a story that maybe was worth telling. And I actually had a scholar, somebody with a PhD who was working on the overall exhibit project that questioned why we were going to devote so much space to Native American history, because it wasn't relevant to the Adirondacks. He later admitted that that was a gross error on his part to have made that statement. And I think Erik will be talking a little bit more about this subject in a little while. But we still get people all the time who say, Native Americans didn't really live here now, did they? And that's simply not true. We continue to work with the Native American community today. In 2018, we initiated a Mohawk and Abenaki art market, which is very popular. And when we first started the series of markets, we actually got some grant funding and did business training with the artists from the two communities so that they could price their work and figure out how to market it. So it was sort of a comprehensive initiative. I want to say too that although the population of the Adirondacks itself is not diverse, there are a lot of diverse people who live at the edges right outside the park. So in 2016, we began reaching out to schools in the Utica area, in the Plattsburgh area, also in Glens Falls. These are all places outside the blue line of the park. And in that way, we were able to begin reaching more diverse student bodies. And pre-COVID, we were serving 10 to 11,000 young people every year with free programming. And 80% of those students we serve in their schools. We actually clock 10,000, 12,000, 14,000 miles a year, sending our educators to distant schools. Now, of course, with COVID, all of that changed dramatically. We're still in the process of trying to rebuild to get to where we were in 2019 before the COVID epidemic. But now I guess the silver lining there is that we provide programming online as well as in person in the schools and here at the museum. One of the other things we've been doing in recent years, in 2019, we launched a diversity fellowship program, and it ranges, the first year we had 6 fellows. This year we're going to have 2 and have them on longer than just for 10 weeks, which is what the original program involved. And part of the reason for doing this is to introduce BIPOC students to museums and museum careers. And I'm pleased to say the young lady second from the left in this image, Nairi Dowdy, came back to the Adirondack Experience and worked with us for a year. She's here now working on a cataloging project. And this fall, she's going to William and Mary to start work on her PhD. And she wants to work in the museum field. So we're very excited about that. Some of the other things we've been doing in recent years, I mentioned our collections were not very diverse, not only our exhibits, but also our collections. So we're always looking for opportunities to diversify them. And in 2018, we had the opportunity to acquire this cabin. It's on the grounds, or was on the grounds, of the Siegel Music Colony, which has students, fellows every summer that come to them and they train them in music. And in the summer of 1957, coincidentally, the same year that the Adirondack Experience opened, they had their first Black fellow, whose name was Fulton Fryer, and you see him on the right there. And although they brought him in, they didn't want him to live with the white students. So they built this little, you might call it a cottage or a cabin or a shack. Mr. Fryer called it a closet. It became known as Fulton Fryer's Closet. And we discovered it was going to be demolished in 2018. And instead we brought it to the museum. And on the lower left, you see Mr. Fryer standing in front of the so-called closet in one of our exhibit galleries. Well, in 2019, working with the Wild Center, which is a science museum in this area, we applied to IMLS and the state of New York and received significant funding to do research with African American and Latino communities in cities surrounding the Adirondack Park so that we could begin to document what some of the challenges and opportunities might be to encourage people to visit here. And there are lots of challenges. People are not necessarily interested in being someplace where they're going to be the only Black person or the only Latino person. They might be stared at. They wonder about how they're going to be received. We also learned there was a lot of interest in visiting as well, which was very exciting. So we're trying to maximize our ability to reach out to people and introduce them now to the museum and to the Adirondacks. And so this year, I should have said our study, although funded in 2019, it was supposed to get underway in 20, and then COVID happened. So we didn't actually get to implement the study until 2021. And now this year, on a pilot basis, we're beginning to bring groups from Albany to the museum. This is a group that just visited a few days before the recording of this video. And we're working with a group called Outdoor Afro to bring some of their members to the museum. And we're hoping to expand this program in 2023 by also bringing people here from Utica and from Syracuse, in addition to Albany. So COVID did something else for us. You know, we had been talking or thinking of it as an institution of doing programming online, but we never quite got around to it. Well, with COVID, we got online like everybody else. And one of the things we did in 2020 was a whole series of programs on the Black experience in the Adirondacks. And we joined with an organization called the Adirondack Diversity Initiative, which is being funded by the state of New York. We joined with them to put on this program. And the executive director is Dr. Nikki Hilton Patterson, the woman on the left. And in this program, this is a screenshot, she's interviewing Gretchen Soren, who I would guess is known to many of you. And in 2020, she came out with a book, Driving While Black, that also became the subject of a PBS documentary. And this is a subject of particular importance here in the Adirondacks, because driving while Black is a big problem here, as it is in many parts of the country. Well, after this very successful series of 10 programs, we started to talk to Dr. Hilton Patterson about some of her plans for the future, and she indicated she wanted to do a symposium, a scholarly symposium, on the subject of environmental justice and how it related to this area. And coincidentally, in early 2021, last year, we began conversations with the Adirondack chapter of the Nature Conservancy, which was beginning to look into this whole issue of environmental justice, because they're very concerned that as a could be perceived as an all-white elitist organization. The question for them is, for many environmental organizations these days, is who are they saving all of these zillions of acres for exactly? And so the Nature Conservancy had commissioned 2 studies to look at the whole role of race and class in the preservation of the Adirondacks. And they actually came and did a presentation for our board on this subject. And it helps that we share 2 board members. One of our board members is actually chair of the board of the Nature Conservancy. And so that got a whole dialogue going about whether perhaps the Nature Conservancy, the museum, and the Adirondack Diversity Initiative might do something around the area of the subject of environmental justice. And since all of those 3 organizations also work with the Wild Center, which is the major science center in this area, we all hit upon the idea of joining together to do a program series. So we packaged an idea of doing a series of 8 programs and organizing a symposium, all of it online, and sent it off to IMLS, and we got funded. And we also got some New York State funding as well. And I show on the screen here just a couple of the recent speakers in our series. And we were very fortunate to find Dr. Reardon to direct this program, and he's been doing just a crackerjack job. We appreciate all of his efforts. And we were looking for sort of an image for our webpage to promote this whole idea. And we pulled this 18th century map that had written on it for the Adirondacks, a wild, unsettled place. And of course, in the 18th century and before, it was anything but wild and unsettled, because it was a place of residence for the Mohawk and the Abenaki. So before I turn things over to Erik to tell you more about the actual series that we're working on, I might also mention that the Adirondack Experience has lots more work to do in order to tell the stories of all the people who have been part of the Adirondack story over the ages. And so we're just in the early stages of working on a permanent exhibit about African Americans in the Adirondacks. And the interesting, if you want to call it that, thing that I'm experiencing now as I talk to people about this is I'm hearing the same attitude that I got when we were working on the Mohawk and Abenaki project years ago. Well, there really haven't been that many Black people who've lived here, or there's not enough of them to, really devote an entire exhibit to, why are you doing this? I had actually a state official who oversees the John Brown Farm State Historic Site asked me why we needed to do an exhibit, because I already have an exhibit about Black people in the Adirondacks. So it's just fascinating to hear all this yet again. But of course, Black people have a very rich story in the Adirondacks. And I have on the screen here a bomber jacket. We had a Tuskegee Airman here in the Adirondacks, and not only in the Adirondacks, the hamlet of Blue Mountain Lake is part of the town of Indian Lake. He was from Indian Lake. And so we have his bomber jacket and his Medal of Honor. So it's sort of a down payment on creating a collection that can tell the story of African Americans in this region, but we're dedicated to the idea, and we will collect the necessary material and present an exhibit in 2025, we're aiming for. So with that, I am going to turn things over to Dr. Reardon to tell you all about the series that we've developed.
Well, thanks so much, David, and thank you, Deborah, for inviting David and myself to participate in this series. And so I'd like to share my screen and just tell everyone a little bit about what we've been doing with this environmental justice virtual program series. So I just wanted to start with a quote from one of my personal sort of historical heroes, a historian by the name of Erik Reardon, who was until very recently had a long, illustrious career at Columbia University. And in a book he wrote called Who Owns History, he says, and I quote, "Historians view the search for new perspectives as the lifeblood of historical understanding." And I think, I could not agree with this assessment more. Revision, reinterpretation are only natural parts of the historical process as values shift, beliefs and perspectives shift from one generation to the next. And historians quite naturally want to revisit traditional understandings of how we understand and approach the study of the past. And from my perspective, and a lot of environmental historians who study these things, this should, of course, apply to the ways in which humanity has interacted, shaped, manipulated, exploited, sometimes destroyed the natural world, but conversely, the ways in which humanity has protected, preserved, and stewarded the natural world as well. So for much of the history of public lands in the United States and North America, historians, particularly around the time of the environmental movement, wrote about, interpreted public lands as, something to celebrate, to champion, really a welcome move away from corporate and private dominance of natural resources and land, particularly west of the Mississippi River. And of course, I think we can all agree that it is important to really, reaffirm commitments to wilderness preservation, to resource conservation. There's a reason why Ken Burns put out a documentary series declaring that national parks are America's best idea. And I think many people would agree with him. But I think it's equally important for historical commitment to understanding who were the primary beneficiaries of those types of preservation achievements. And so with our series, Adirondacks for All, we do really want to redefine, reinterpret this idea of wilderness, of preservation through an expansive lens of environmental justice. We want to account for blind spots in these conservation and preservation achievements in the US. And so for the focus, of course, as David described for this series, is this space known as the Adirondack Park. As he mentioned, it's a 6 million acre patchwork of forest preserve residential hamlets, a really unique approach to conservation and preservation in the United States. But I think, of course, exclusively celebratory narratives tend to leave out the experiences, the contributions, the perspectives of marginalized communities. So Adirondack Park was established in 1892 in a piece of legislation, and I quote, "for the free use of all the people for their health and pleasure," end quote. So I think we can all recognize that this is absolutely an ideal that is worth defending, worth striving for, but we can also recognize the ways in which that in reality, the park as a space has really never lived up to this high-minded democratic ideal. Instead, as I mentioned, for much of the time in which historians have studied conservation, wilderness preservation, has been through these very romantic and celebratory narratives. So folks like Winslow Homer, who painted in the Adirondacks, James Fenimore Cooper, famous romantic novelist who wrote about sort of frontiersmen and indigenous people in the Adirondacks. It was very much through this romantic and celebratory lens. But as I mentioned, this series really wants to confront these deeper and darker legacies of dispossession, of systemic racism, of inequality that contribute to this very unfortunate sense that the Adirondacks belong to a certain class of people, but not to others. So by seeking to expand the traditional boundaries of environmental justice, we're exploring questions, for example, whose stories are being told when we celebrate multi-generational attachment to Adirondack land and water? Who historically have been the beneficiaries of conservation and preservation in this region? And then finally, how have diverse communities, including indigenous peoples and African Americans, found meaning and inspiration from the Adirondacks region? So I just want to give you a couple examples from our program series of how we're trying to accomplish this and how we're trying to explore those questions. And I think it really does begin with accounting for the presence, the persistence, but unfortunately, ultimately, the dispossession of indigenous communities that cleared the way for the kinds of wilderness preservation efforts that we saw in the form of parks like Adirondack Park, other public lands across the United States. The Adirondack Mountains, for many people, the lakes, the forests, the high peaks region are really this international symbol of wilderness. And the way in which I think we often conceive of wilderness, it's a space that, you know, humans are considered to be, you know, historically speaking, relatively recent intruders into those ecosystems and spaces. But in fact, the story of human existence in the Adirondacks runs much deeper than the forest itself. We had a scientist from Paul Smith's college, Kurt Stager, come and give a presentation in our series. And folks are often quite surprised to learn that the human history of the Adirondacks actually predates the forests themselves, and that it was at the end of the last ice age, when the landscape was still mostly open tundra, that the predecessors and the ancestors of Haudenosaunee and Abenaki peoples made their way into this region. Unfortunately, there are these false historical narratives that try to erase this deeper history that's embedded within the archaeological record and within the oral tradition of these indigenous communities. And you see from the slide here, who I owe this to Kurt Stager from Paul Smith's college, there is ample archaeological evidence for indigenous presence in the Adirondacks that goes back into the geological record thousands and thousands of years. So there is really no factual basis to make the claim that indigenous people did not live here, make their homes here, find their subsistence here, practice their culture and life ways here. And I think it's incredibly important. This is something that David and the Adirondack Experience has been really dedicated to over the past several years, is partnering with indigenous cultural institutions to make sure that they are involved in telling stories about their own communities. And so there is an institution called the Six Nations Iroquois Cultural Center in Onchioto, New York, in the Adirondacks, that is working to really, show people that there is a deep history of Haudenosaunee Mohawk people in this region, and there are fascinating collections of artifacts that help us access that history and that story, where the traditional documentary record unfortunately won't allow us to access those histories. Another important part of this virtual program series is not just demonstrating to folks that Indigenous people have lived here historically, but it's confronting this legacy of broken treaties, of illegal land cessions and sales, of decades, if not more than a century, of dispossession that essentially robbed Haudenosaunee and Mohawk people of their traditional land base. But for these communities, these are lands that they still feel very much connected to, and that during this age of sort of social protest of the 1960s and 70s, were willing to use direct political action to try to bring awareness to the problems of historical injustices that disconnected them from the land and resources that had sustained their communities for countless generations. So Indigenous people, Mohawk people, still claim the Adirondacks region as part of their historical territory, and frustrated by centuries of broken treaties, steady erosion and attacks on their political sovereignty, a group of traditionalist Mohawk folks from Caughnawaga and Akwesasne came down to the Adirondacks region to Moss Lake near Old Forge in 1974 and occupied this space, which was a former Girl Scout camp, to try to make their stand and reclaim this portion of their ancestral territory. We had the occupation of Alcatraz Island in 1969, which was actually led by a Mohawk activist by the name of Richard Oakes. Of course, the 1973 dramatic episode of the occupation of Wounded Knee, but this history also touches upon the Adirondacks region as well. After 3 years of negotiation with state officials in New York, this Mohawk community accepted 600 acres of land to establish the community of Ganianka, which is called Land of the Flint, near Altona, New York. And so this is a program series we're going to actually hear from someone who was from the Onondaga Nation, just south of Syracuse, who's going to tell us about her experience of being involved in the occupation of Moss Lake and the role of direct action political protest for Indigenous peoples in the 1960s and the 1970s. And of course, trying to recover the experience of African-American peoples in the Adirondacks has also been a central focus of this series, and how we're seeking to redefine environmental justice. The wilderness of the Adirondacks actually played a pretty significant role in the Underground Railroad for much of the 19th century. For a period of time, the Adirondacks was home to the radical abolitionist John Brown. Thanks to John Brown and Garrett Smith, who is a wealthy landowner and a philanthropist, they helped to put up the funds to purchase lands to relocate Black farmers to the Adirondacks in the mid-19th century, because the New York State Legislature reinstated a law that denied Black men the right to vote unless they could satisfy a $250 property requirement. And so it was this really interesting kind of radical social project going on here, this experiment in multiracial democracy for this kind of brief historical moment. And 3,000 free Black people did move to the Adirondacks and try to meet that property requirement in order to have access to the franchise. And as Aaron Mayer, who presented on this topic, told us, justice is equal protection under the law. And if it was Adirondack wilderness, Adirondack land that helped to facilitate the opportunity to gain equal protection under the law, that is a fascinating connection and redefinition of environmental justice embedded within Adirondack history. So for this very, interesting historical moment, the Adirondacks really represent a space of potential African-American liberation. But the paradox in this story is that, about a century later, the Adirondacks represent something quite different to African-American communities. So for, over 2 centuries, the remote forestlands, the high peaks of the Adirondacks, they provided all sorts of opportunities for middle-class recreation, for wilderness adventure, for scientific research. But at the same time, those same natural characteristics led state and federal officials to look toward the North Country as a convenient location to site a network of state and federal prisons. So towns and villages across the Adirondacks have really, come to rely on prisons, unfortunately, as a source of economic development, as a source of employment, as a source of state funding. As one of our programs really explored quite deeply, even the park's recreational infrastructure is tied into the region's network of prisons, as the poorly paid labor of incarcerated workers supports otherwise unaffordable conservation projects across the region. So in this sense, it's incredibly important to confront the ways in which Adirondack wilderness has been shaped and really curated by this unfortunate trend towards mass incarceration. And a shocking statistic that was revealed to me that I didn't know during one of our programs was that 70% of African Americans in the Adirondack region are incarcerated. So we can't talk about wilderness preservation and environmental justice in the Adirondacks without recognizing the ways in which that has been tied into this system of mass incarceration. And as we see right here, it's just impossible to ignore from this map, this network of state and federal prisons that is really inseparable for African-American people, inseparable from the larger experience of the Adirondacks. And it's really unfortunate that public lands, something that is supposed to be for everyone, the birthright of every American citizen, in the original legislation, the Adirondacks for the health and pleasure of all the people, this is certainly not the reality for African-American communities who view the Adirondacks through the lens of mass incarceration. So the challenge for us is really, how can we articulate a vision for a more inclusive and equitable Adirondacks? And as a historian, I've always argued that it's really impossible for us to chart a course of where we want to get to if we don't know where we've been, if we don't have a good understanding of our own history. And so with the challenges, environmental challenges that we face today, and they are myriad: climate change, pollution, environmental destruction, deforestation, it is of course important to celebrate, to reaffirm, to build upon and expand upon the region's historic commitment to conservation and preservation. But I think I would argue, David, folks at the Adirondack Experience, the Wild Center, the Nature Conservancy, the Adirondack Diversity Initiative, we would argue that it's equally important to make sure the benefits of those achievements are distributed and shared equally across New York State and beyond. So if we're going to articulate this vision of a more inclusive Adirondacks, invite all New Yorkers, all Americans into the stewardship of this space, we have to recognize the contributions and the experiences of diverse communities that across generations call the Adirondacks home. And with that, I would invite Deborah to come back into the session and ask a couple questions.
Thank you. That was fantastic. Thank you both so much. My head is spinning with questions, and it's incredibly provocative to me, the work that you're doing. So before I toss some of my questions to you both, I want to acknowledge our sign language interpreters and thank them for their excellent work, Rachel and Lucy. They've been great throughout the series, and it enhances the access to all of these programs, and we're really grateful to you. So where to begin? I'm very struck by the ways in which you've incorporated and very deliberately worked on relationships with community and a wide range of community through this work. And you touched a little bit on, some of the challenges of that and building trust, which is something that I think is, as museums aspire to doing more and more engagement with communities in a variety of ways, I think this is a really important issue. And so I'm wondering whether both of you have, maybe some comments to expand upon, maybe even examples of the ways in which you've both had success, but also, some of the things that you have to continue to work on in terms of building trust within, whether it's the indigenous communities or the African American communities that you've been reaching out to.
Well, I just might share some interesting perspectives with as a result of groups that we are bringing up from Albany, New York this summer. I think maybe in our minds we're thinking, well, all these folks, they're going to go and see all the exhibits, and dutifully read all the labels and that sort of thing. But that's not necessarily the experience they're looking for. And they're equally interested in looking at the scenery, or probably more interested, actually, many of them in looking at the scenery or hiking one of our trails. And so it's beginning to have us sort of rethink what's the experience that we want to share or we should be sharing, because our vision of what's here and what's on offer isn't necessarily what people want. And so, that's been an interesting experience that we're still cogitating on and trying to figure out how to negotiate that. But it's been very interesting for us.
And I would just say from my experience, the folks I've been working with, the speakers and the presenters that have been participating in our series have been really eager to partner and collaborate with the Adirondack Experience, the Nature Conservancy, Adirondack Diversity Initiative, and the Wild Center. I think, if anything, there's, a sense of, we've been wanting to tell these stories for a long time, and for too long we haven't had the venue or the platform to do that. So, David could speak to that. The museum has a sort of pretty impressive built-in network of people communities they engage with that are positioned to speak to these topics of these important issues. And then it was sort of my job to just kind of build that out and to try to find people from communities of color, from indigenous communities that, are essentially cultural educators and can bring their experience and their perspectives to a larger audience. And they've been really pleased to have the opportunity to work with the Adirondack Experience to do just that.
I might mention one other thing too, because this came as such a revelation to me. One of our speakers was Dr. Alice Green, and she was on a panel discussion here a couple of years ago, and she mentioned to me, she's a resident of Albany, and she was born in the Adirondacks, so she's a big proponent of people coming up here. And she told me a couple of years ago that whenever she tells her friends they should visit the Adirondacks, she hears from them being that place where they put Black people in prison. And so that, that's really something to try to digest, that, here we are, we're trying to promote the great outdoors and the museum and cultural experiences. And we have this perception that's out there that has to be dealt with, and it's a reality. And so that's something we keep in mind as well.
Let me pick up on that because, the statistics were breathtaking about the numbers of people incarcerated in the area. And I guess, as somebody who's an educator at heart, I immediately wondered whether you are in fact considering the people in those prisons as part of your community. Are there opportunities for, courses or, conversations within those communities to also be grappling with this and learning about it? it just struck me as something that could be very potentially incredibly interesting.
Well, you're right, and I don't want to get ahead of myself, but we're actually interviewing a candidate for librarian here who worked in one of the prisons for 4 years as librarian, and so of course that got me thinking about how we might use that network. But yes, to answer your question, it's an obvious one, and it's something that we've begun thinking about. I did learn from this gentleman that there's no Zoom programs like we're doing. That's not permissible. Everything has to be in person, and so that's just one thing to think about. It's a little more challenging than we're just going to tune in. But it's certainly something that we want to consider, and it'll be interesting if we have the opportunity to have someone who has an in, so to speak, in terms of how all that works, if we could have such a person on our staff.
I do know that I don't know specifically whether Syracuse University or one of the local universities has some courses that they offer in the prisons, but that I know there's kind of a network of people nationally who do that work. So interesting. I guess, I'm also struck by the amount of careful listening you're doing as you do this series, which is a theme that seems to have run actually through our Redefining Narrative. In speaking to Zahir Ali, who's an oral historian, the importance not just of gathering oral history, but of listening to the stories that have been gathered, as well as Kevin White, who spoke about his work in really trying to get a handle on more of the indigenous stories that have been buried often in libraries and museums. So I see a theme that keeps going through all of this, and clearly the work you're doing, that has manifested in these programs, has so much of a potential life beyond that. And I'm kind of curious whether you are planning exhibitions based on some of this research or additional publications, and whether you could tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I think I mentioned a little earlier. I think that this series will certainly inform the exhibit on African American history that we're just in the early process of developing. So it's sort of like an early research project, as it were, to begin laying out some of the themes. And I must say that it might cause us to go back. I showed an image of the exhibit that we created in 2017 on the Mohawk and the Abenaki, and it was created in consultation with them. They read all the scripts and all the dialogue that was going to go into videos and all that sort of thing. But we may want to revisit that exhibit and how certain stories are presented there. Not that we were trying to soft pedal anything, but I think there are probably narratives that we missed 5 years ago that, were we to be doing that exhibit today and following this program series, we would approach somewhat differently. So I think that's probably also something else that's on the agenda. And, in terms of publications, who knows? One thing that we were considering was a documentary of some kind that might come out of this. We did one recently, the Adirondack Experience did one recently with Mountain Lake Public Broadcasting on the establishment of the Adirondack Park Agency, which has zoning authority for the region. And that 1 hour documentary, it was carried on 800 stations nationwide. And so that sort of got us to thinking, this is kind of an interesting way to get a story out. And so it's a possibility that might be an outcome of this project. So we'll see. So Erik, are you up for being in a documentary?
That might be a bit beyond my pay grade. I'm happy to participate.
Okay.
I would just echo what David is saying, and I think one of the pleasures of coming on to work on this project is seeing firsthand how cultural institutions are making real efforts to engage with the communities they tell stories about. And I think you're right, Deborah, that for too long, cultural institutions and academics had something of an extractive relationship to the communities that they studied and communicated about. And I think those are quite reasonable critiques. And I think they've been taken to heart by a lot of these organizations. And it's just such a delight to see the potential for collaboration and partnership with different organizations, individuals, and communities to invite them in to educating people about their perspectives and their experiences.
It's great. I guess a couple of last questions for you both. One of the things that I'm very curious about is the relationship between this history that you're reconsidering and issues that often are taken up more by science museums, natural history museums, having to do with the reality of the environmental condition of our national parks, of our open spaces. And I'm very excited about the sort of imagining what it would be for you, Erik, and some of the folks that we know in those other kinds of institutions to be sort of having a cross-fertilized conversation about this.
Yeah, with the, any number, take your pick, what's the environmental crisis of the moment. Another obvious and fascinating potential for collaboration is on the front of traditional ecological knowledge and indigenous knowledge. And this is something that Jen Crester at the Wild Center has been really keen to invite indigenous people like Dave Fadden, who helps to run that Six Nations Iroquois Cultural Center in Onchayota, bring him in to integrate that traditional ecological perspective into their science communication programs. And so I think, not just in the realm of sort of public humanities, which I think this project is more directly focused on, but in, natural science museums, science communication, I think this is another, fascinating opportunity, because at the end of the day, I think we need a more holistic view for how we're managing and sort of dealing with our relationship to the natural world. And I think we need pretty significant changes. I think folks would recognize, and that, this is a potential to sort of find solutions, perhaps.
Absolutely. That's great. David, last thoughts from you about other projects related to this that you are excited about in other museums, or, are there things about what you are doing that you want people to know beyond this project?
Well, maybe just to touch on a couple of things that are happening elsewhere. There's a new exhibit at the National Museum of the American Indian in New York branch, Native New York. I don't know, Deborah, if you've gotten to see that yet. It was, it's an interesting exhibit, and it does touch on some of these environmental issues, issues of environmental justice as well. So I think that's well worth noting. And going back to memory lane, New York Historical a number of years ago did an exhibit on Seneca Village, which was, an African-American village on the site of Central Park, that was cleared to make way for the park. And, that's right up there with kind of theme that we're looking at here, the creation of these, parks and natural spaces for whom. Exactly. And so that's an interesting project that took place that's well worth looking at. I think there's probably a book that came out of that.
Yes. And I think there's a lot on their website as well about it.
Yeah. So those are the projects I would mention, I think.
Great, great. I can't thank you both enough for the time you spent on this with us. We're looking forward to the conversations that spring forth in the field and from knowing more about your project. And we truly look forward to keeping track of the fruits of your labors. So thank you again so much.
And thank you for
Deborah.
your interest. We really appreciate it.